Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories, the only history channel on the internet where you can learn something genuinely interesting and still be asleep before the third segment. Tonight, we are heading somewhere groovy, hazy, and significantly less hygienic than your living room. We're going back to the 1960s, not the sleek Mad Men version with the sharp suits and the cigarette holders, but the other 60s. The barefoot, tie-dye, sleeping in a field, questioning the entire fabric of society 60s, the ones that smelled like patchouli, campfire smoke, and whatever was burning in that hand-rolled cigarette your neighbour was definitely just using for spiritual reasons. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. I mean that. No pressure, no guilt, just a quiet tap of the button if this is your kind of thing, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always someone's strange, insomniac midnight somewhere, and honestly, that's beautiful. Now, let's talk about the hippies. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to walk away from everything, your job, your haircut, your parents' disappointment, and just go? Did these people eat real food, or was it just granola and ideology? What do you say when your commune runs out of toothpaste and no one wants to go to the store because the store is a symbol of corporate oppression? Could you share a sleeping bag with 4 strangers in a field in upstate New York and still wake up believing in the goodness of humanity? What did it feel like to be 22 years old in 1967, standing in a crowd of 100,000 people? All of you barefoot, all of you sunburned, all of you absolutely certain that this, right here, right now, was the moment the world was about to change forever. And what happened when it didn't? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1967. The year is loud, the world is burning, the music is extraordinary, and someone near you is definitely weaving a flower crown out of dandelions they pulled from a highway median. You have no shoes. You have opinions, and somewhere, about 3 miles away, there is a festival happening that you are absolutely going to walk to. Good luck. Let's set the scene, because you cannot understand the hippies without understanding what they were pushing back against. And what they were pushing back against was a country that had just spent 15 years trying very, very hard to be normal. You're in America in the early 1960s, and from the outside, everything looks fine. Suspiciously fine. The lawns are mowed, the cars are enormous, the refrigerators are humming with casseroles. Your father goes to work in a suit. Your mother has opinions about the correct way to fold a napkin. The neighbours wave from their driveways. Everyone smiles at church. No one discusses anything uncomfortable at dinner. Not the war, not the bomb, not the fact that roughly half the country is legally treated as less than human, depending on what state they happen to be standing in. It is tidy. It is coordinated. It is, if you look at it from a certain angle, absolutely suffocating. This was post-war America, a country that had survived the Depression and 2 world wars and emerged from the wreckage of the 1940s with a very specific plan. Acquire things, keep quiet, be grateful, and do not, under any circumstances, make a scene. The suburbs bloomed overnight like concrete mushrooms. Families moved out of the cities and into identical houses on identical streets. And they bought televisions and washing machines and lawnmowers, and they told themselves this was freedom. And for a lot of people it genuinely was. The prosperity was real. The relief was real. After years of rationing and loss and global catastrophe, having a warm house and a full refrigerator was not nothing. But here is the thing about a very tidy surface. It requires a great deal of energy to maintain. The post-war bargain came with terms. You would be comfortable, yes. You would be safe, relatively. But in exchange, you would conform. You would not ask too many questions about the Korean War, or about what the government was doing with all those nuclear weapons it kept testing in the Nevada desert, or about why certain Americans had to sit at the back of the bus in a country that described itself as the land of the free. The social contract of post-war America was essentially, Here is your refrigerator and your two-car garage, and please do not look too hard at the machinery behind the curtain. The young people growing up inside this arrangement were called the baby boomers, born in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, children of soldiers and factory workers and suburban homemakers who had built this world with genuine sacrifice and wanted, quite naturally, for their children to enjoy it. And the children did enjoy it. They had more material comfort than any previous generation of the young Americans. They had television and rock and roll and cars. They also had something their parents had not expected to provide: the education and the leisure time to sit with questions that the previous generation had been too busy surviving to ask. The television that was supposed to unite the family was also, quietly, showing them Birmingham, showing them Vietnam, showing them the gap between the America their parents described and the America that actually existed. A black minister was telling the country about a dream, and the response from much of white authority was fire hoses. A president was assassinated in a motorcade in Dallas, in broad daylight, and the official explanation left a great many people deeply unsatisfied. The neat, clean story had cracks in it, and through those cracks, light was getting in, and light, as anyone who has ever tried to keep a secret knows, has a way of making everything visible whether you want it to be or not. Something loud and strange and flower-scented was about to come pouring out, and the casseroles were not going to stop it. Before the tie-dye, before the festivals, before anyone had thought to put a daisy in a soldier's gun barrel, there were the beats. And the beats were the hippies' slightly more pretentious, slightly more caffeinated older siblings, the ones who had already decided that conventional America was not for them, back when doing so was genuinely strange and not yet a movement you could buy a poster of. You're sitting in a dimly lit coffee shop in Greenwich Village or North Beach, San Francisco, sometime in the mid to late 1950s. The espresso is strong. Someone is reading poetry out loud, and it is not the rhyming kind. A man in a turtleneck is playing bongos in the corner, and no one finds this particularly unusual. Welcome to the Beat Generation, a loose, chaotic, wildly literate group of writers, artists, and professional misfits who had decided, in the aftermath of World War II, that the American dream was a con, that conformity was a kind of spiritual death, and that the only honest response to a dishonest world was to get in a car, drive across the country, and write about it at tremendous speed. Jack Kerouac published On the Road in 1957, and it hit a certain type of young American like a freight train. It was messy and romantic and exhausting and alive, a book about movement, about freedom, about choosing experience over security. Kerouac wrote in what he called spontaneous prose, which meant he sat down at the typewriter and produced long rolling sentences without stopping to revise, which was either a revolutionary artistic method or an elaborate justification for not editing his work, and honestly it was probably both. Young people read it and felt, maybe for the first time, that there was another option, that America was not just the suburbs and the suits and the carefully managed expectations, but also the open highway and the 3 a.m. conversation and the stranger you met in a bus station in Denver who changed the way you thought about everything. Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, published in 1956, went even further. It opened with the line, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked," and then it kept going from there, for pages, in a torrent of imagery that was furious and tender and sexually explicit and spiritually ecstatic all at once. The government actually tried to have it banned for obscenity, which, as anyone who has ever watched the news could tell you, is the single most effective marketing strategy a poem can have. Howl was read by everyone who needed to read it, and what many of them felt reading it was recognition, the shock of seeing their own suppressed discomfort with the official world expressed in language that did not apologize for itself. William Burroughs was publishing strange fragmented novels about addiction and control and the arbitrary nature of social reality. Lawrence Ferlinghetti was running City Lights bookstore in San Francisco, which was not just a bookstore but a gathering place and a publishing house, and a kind of permission slip for everyone who walked through the door. The Beats were not yet the hippies. They were more intellectual, more literary, and more interested in jazz clubs and European existentialism than in communal living and organic gardening. But they planted the seed, firmly, publicly, in the most conspicuous soil they could find. They said, clearly and loudly, that opting out of conventional America was not only possible but potentially the more honest, more alive, more human thing to do. The hippies, coming 10 years later, took that seed and added sunshine, and the result was considerably louder and considerably less interested in Proust. Let's talk about San Francisco, because you cannot tell this story without it. If the hippie movement had a hometown, it was San Francisco specifically, a neighbourhood called Haight-Ashbury, which in the mid-1960s was a slightly run-down Victorian district of tall painted houses and cheap rents, where young people were beginning to gather in numbers that were either inspiring or alarming, depending entirely on who you asked. You arrive in Haight-Ashbury sometime around 1965, and the first thing you notice is that it does not look like a revolution. It looks like a neighbourhood where the landlords got tired of keeping up appearances and the young people moved in and covered everything in murals. The houses are colourful and slightly battered. There are record shops and head shops, small stores selling incense and rolling papers and books about Eastern philosophy. There are people sitting on stoops in the afternoon sun, some of them playing guitars, some of them reading, some of them in various states of altered consciousness that they will later describe as spiritual exploration. The rents were cheap because the neighbourhood was unfashionable, which meant it was exactly the right kind of place for people who had decided to stop doing what was expected of them. San Francisco itself had a particular character that made all of this possible. It had always been a little wilder than the rest of the country, a city built during a gold rush, shaped by waves of immigrants and sailors and gold seekers and dreamers, tolerant of eccentricity in a way that most of settled, orderly America simply was not. It had a thriving arts scene, a strong tradition of political radicalism going back to the labour movements of the early 20th century, and enough coffee shops and bookstores to sustain a population of people who were, professionally speaking, figuring themselves out. The city also had a radio station, KSAN, that was beginning to play something new, album rock, long tracks, music that did not fit into the 2-minute pop format that commercial radio had enforced for years. If you wanted to play a 12-minute song in 1965, San Francisco was one of the few places in America where someone would broadcast it. And it had venues, the Fillmore Auditorium, the Avalon Ballroom, where new bands were playing for hours, and the audiences were not sitting politely in rows but were moving, and the lights were moving in patterns designed by a new profession that did not yet have a name, and the whole experience was constructed to feel like something other than a normal Tuesday. Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters had moved through and left a particular kind of energy behind, a conviction that reality was more flexible than it appeared, and that the right combination of music and colour and pharmacological assistance could demonstrate this flexibility in real time. The Diggers, a group of anarchist theatre performers, were already feeding people for free in the park and running a store where everything cost nothing, as a daily demonstration that exchange did not require money if you chose to organise things differently. There was a Zen centre, there were poets, there were painters who had been up for 3 days working on something that they could not quite explain but which seemed, in the moment, urgently necessary. Haight-Ashbury in 1965 and 66 was the place where all of these things converged. The cheap rent, the tolerant city, the new music, the ideas borrowed from the Beats and filtered through something stranger and more communal and considerably more colourful. It was the Petri dish. The conditions were right. Something was about to grow in it that would spread much further than the neighbourhood, much further than the city, and much further than anyone standing on those stoops in the afternoon sun had yet imagined. Let's talk about what you are wearing, because in 1967, what you wear is not just fashion. It is a statement. It is a manifesto. It is a complete and total declaration of war against the khaki pant. You're standing in front of a mirror in a communal house in Haight-Ashbury, and the outfit you have assembled this morning is technically made of clothes, but it would be genuinely difficult to explain to your grandmother. Your shirt is tie-dyed in swirling patterns of purple and orange, a technique achieved by twisting fabric, applying dye, and accepting that the result will be beautiful and completely unpredictable, much like life itself, which is more or less the point. Your jeans are flared from the knee down in a way that suggests they were designed to sweep the floor clean as you walk, which is not their intended purpose, but is an accurate description of their function. They're embroidered along the seam with flowers and small peace signs, stitched there by hand late at night, while someone played guitar in the next room. Your feet are bare or in sandals because shoes with structure feel like a metaphor for something, and you're not currently in the mood for metaphors you disagree with. Your hair is long, longer than your parents have words for. If you are a man, your hair is the single most political object in your life at this particular moment in history. Longer than your father's. Longer than your boss would permit if you had a boss, which you are actively working to avoid. The length of your hair communicates to anyone paying attention that you have consciously opted out of a set of rules that say men should look a certain way, work a certain way, present themselves to the world a certain way. It is also, practically speaking, quite warm in summer, but that is a secondary concern. If you are a woman, you have abandoned the heavily constructed femininity of the previous decade. The girdles, the elaborate hairstyles held in place with industrial quantities of spray, the careful performance of put-togetherness that the 1950s had demanded. Your hair is natural, long, possibly braided with ribbon, or adorned with flowers. You're not wearing a girdle. You may or may not be wearing a bra, a choice that has been politicised by people who are not you, to your considerable annoyance. Your dress is loose and flowing, printed in patterns that owe something to Indian textiles and something to a particularly vivid dream. The aesthetic borrowed from everywhere and belonged to nowhere. Native American beadwork worn as jewellery, Indian printed cotton brought back from travels or bought in import shops along Haight Street, military surplus jackets worn not in honour of war but in a cheerful act of reclamation, as a garment stripped of its original meaning and refilled with a new one. Flowers, always flowers, tucked behind ears, woven into hair, held out toward strangers and famously toward the barrels of National Guard rifles at anti-war demonstrations. The flower offered to a soldier was not naivety, exactly. It was a very specific kind of provocation, a statement about what force looked like against the refusal of force, about what a gun looked like when the person standing in front of it was holding something that would simply wilt and die. It looked chaotic from the outside. It was chaotic from the inside too, honestly. But underneath the chaos was a very deliberate act of self-construction, a daily, visible, walking down the street declaration that you had chosen something different. And in a culture that had enforced conformity as quietly and thoroughly as post-war America had, simply choosing to look different was not a small thing. It was, in its way, the gentlest possible form of a very serious argument. Let's talk about the music, because without the music there is no movement. There might still be some interesting philosophy, some well-attended protests, some compelling poetry, but the thing that turned a collection of ideas and grievances into a cultural earthquake was the music. And in the early to mid-1960s, the music was changing in ways that felt, to the people listening, less like entertainment and more like a kind of weather, something you moved through, something that changed the temperature of your thinking. You're somewhere in America in 1964, and a young man from Minnesota named Bob Dylan is doing something to folk music that folk music did not ask for but desperately needed. Dylan had arrived in New York City a few years earlier, sat at the feet of Woody Guthrie, learned the tradition, and then, with the serene confidence of someone who has fully understood the rules and decided to go somewhere else entirely, he began writing songs that were not really songs in any previous sense. Blowin' in the Wind asked questions. The Times They Are a-Changin' issued a warning. Masters of War was a direct address to the people who manufactured and profited from conflict, and it was not polite. These were not songs you danced to. They were songs you sat with at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling, feeling the specific weight of living in a world that did not match the promises made about it. Dylan gave a generation of young Americans the language for a discomfort they had been carrying without a vocabulary. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, one of the most important things a song can do. Across the Atlantic, 4 young men from Liverpool were doing something different but equally destabilising. The Beatles in 1963 and 64 were pure joy, melodic and urgent and impossible not to move to, but by 1965 with Rubber Soul and 1966 with Revolver, they had gone somewhere stranger. Norwegian Wood had a sitar in it. Tomorrow Never Knows drew from Tibetan Buddhism and tape loops and asked you, gently but firmly, to turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. These were not suggestions you expected from a pop group. By 1967, with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Beatles had made an album that sounded like an event, like proof that music had no ceiling, no walls, no rules, and that paying attention to it was a form of participation in something larger than any individual song. The San Francisco bands were doing something different still. The Grateful Dead played songs that did not end so much as evolve, 20-minute improvisations that required a different kind of listening, a patience and an openness to not knowing where you were going. Jefferson Airplane's Somebody to Love and White Rabbit arrived in the summer of '67, like transmissions from a different reality. Grace Slick's voice carrying a quality of absolute conviction that made you feel, even if only for the 3 minutes the song lasted, that she was right about everything. Janis Joplin sang like she was running out of time, which, with terrible unfairness, she was. The music did something that speeches and pamphlets could not quite do. It created a shared emotional experience. 100,000 people hearing the same song at the same moment felt, briefly, like a community. Felt, briefly, that their individual discontents were not merely personal, but collective, and that collective discontents had a different kind of weight. The concert was not just entertainment, it was a gathering. And what gathered, night after night in the Fillmore and the Avalon, and then in fields and parks across the country, was a generation that was becoming conscious of itself as a generation, which is always the first step towards something larger and louder, the summer of love. Even the name sounds like something someone made up, but it was real, gloriously, chaotically, overwhelmingly real. In the summer of 1967, somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 young people converged on the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco, drawn by word of mouth, by the radio, by flyers handed out on street corners and passed from hand to hand across the country. They came from Iowa and Ohio and New Jersey and Texas. They came with backpacks and sleeping bags and, in many cases, absolutely no plan whatsoever. The city of San Francisco had not entirely been warned that this was happening. You arrive in Haight-Ashbury in June of 1967, and the first thing that hits you is the noise. Not unpleasant noise, but the constant overlapping noise of a neighbourhood that has simply run out of space for all the people who have decided they need to be here. Music is coming from every direction. Someone is playing guitar 3 doors down, someone else has a record player in the window, and Jefferson Airplane is spiralling out into the warm air and mixing with incense and frying food, and the particular warm smell of a great many human beings in close proximity, none of whom have made laundry a priority this week. There are people everywhere, on curbs, in the park, outside the Diggers Free store where volunteers are handing out food and clothing to anyone who needs it. No charge, no questions, no forms to fill out. You are hungry, here is food. You need a coat, here is a coat. The Diggers operated on the principle that scarcity was largely a social construction, and they tested this principle every day with remarkable results and considerable logistical strain. The Diggers were, in some ways, the moral conscience of the Summer of Love, the people who took the counterculture's ideals most literally and tried to live them out in the most practical possible way. They ran free kitchens that fed hundreds of people a day. They organised free medical care. They staged theatrical events in the street that were designed not to entertain but to destabilise, to make people question why they paid for things, why they obeyed the rules they obeyed, what the city might look like if it were organised around generosity instead of profit. They were exhausting and visionary, and they absolutely did not have enough volunteers. The neighbourhood was overcrowded in ways that strained infrastructure the neighbourhood had never had in the first place. People were sleeping in Golden Gate Park because there was nowhere else to sleep. The free clinic that Dr. David Smith would open in June was responding to real public health emergencies, young people arriving with no money, no contacts, no plan, and in some cases a bad reaction to something they had taken the night before. The city's social services were not built for this. The police were not sure how to respond to something that was not quite a protest and not quite a party, and was somehow both, and yet. By most accounts of people who were actually there, amid all the overcrowding and the uncertain food supply and the occasional medical emergency, there was also something genuine in the air, a feeling that would be very difficult to fully reconstruct in language, but that people describe for decades afterward with a kind of wistful precision, a feeling of goodwill, of experiment, of the world briefly becoming permeable, briefly allowing the possibility that things did not have to be the way they had always been. It did not last. It was never going to last. But for a few weeks in the summer of 1967, in a neighbourhood in San Francisco that smelled like incense and possibility, it was real. Let's talk about food, because you're in a commune in 1968, and you are hungry, and the question of what to eat has become, somehow, a philosophical discussion. It is Tuesday, or possibly Wednesday. The days have blurred together slightly, which is either a sign of spiritual liberation or a sign that no one remembered to buy a calendar. What is clear is that there is a large pot on the stove, and someone is making something out of brown rice and whatever vegetables were available at the co-op, and the result smells like good intentions and tastes like an argument about whether salt is a tool of corporate agriculture. The discussion about the salt has been going for 11 minutes. You're very hungry. You're also not going to interrupt, because the person arguing against salt has strong feelings and a surprising amount of energy for someone who has not eaten since yesterday. Food in the counterculture was not incidental. It was ideological in a way that would be recognisable to anyone who has ever had a heated conversation about their dietary choices at a family dinner, multiplied by 10 and given a political framework. What you ate said something about who you were, what you believed, and how seriously you took the project of living differently. Meat, for many hippies, was out. Not just for health reasons, but because the industrial meat complex was seen as a microcosm of everything wrong with late capitalist America. The cruelty, the environmental damage, the reduction of living things to units of production and profit. This critique was not wrong, incidentally. It was just sometimes expressed at a volume and frequency that made communal mealtimes extremely tiring. Vegetarianism was not yet mainstream. In 1967, if you told most Americans you did not eat meat, they would look at you with the specific expression of someone who suspects you might be unwell. followed by the expression of someone who's already mentally drafting a concerned letter to your parents. In the counterculture, it was a badge of seriousness, a proof of commitment to the idea that how you lived your daily life was inseparable from your politics. You could not protest the violence of the state and then sit down to a meal produced through violence toward animals. Or at least, a significant number of people felt strongly that you could not, and they would tell you about it at length. Brown rice arrived in the hippie diet through the influence of macrobiotics, a Japanese dietary philosophy adapted and promoted in America by Michio Kushi, and embraced with tremendous enthusiasm by people who found in it a complete system for eating, living, and thinking about the relationship between food and consciousness. Brown rice took longer to cook than white rice. It was chewier. It required soaking and attention, and a patience that white rice in a modern kitchen simply did not demand. These were not bugs, they were features. Slowing down, paying attention, making food from scratch using whole ingredients, these were acts of quiet resistance against a culture of speed and convenience. Communes grew vegetable gardens with wildly varying degrees of success. Some produced genuine abundance, tomatoes and squash and beans and herbs in quantities that fed the community through summer and into fall. Others produced mostly optimism and a few underfed zucchini. The gap between the ideal and the reality was, in food as in many other areas, a persistent feature of commune life. But the effort was real, and the intention behind it was real, and occasionally the food was genuinely good. A pot of vegetable soup eaten outside in the evening, made from things grown in the garden, shared with people you had chosen to live alongside. That was the best version. The salt argument was the other version. Both were, in their way, part of the same experiment. Let's talk about free love, which sounds, from a distance of 60 years, like either a utopian social experiment or an absolute logistical nightmare. And the honest answer is that it was both of those things simultaneously and often on the same afternoon. The counterculture's ideas about love and relationships were, like most of its ideas, a direct reaction against what came before. What came before was a highly structured, socially enforced system of courtship, marriage, fidelity, and the careful management of desire within legally and religiously sanctioned boundaries, which worked reasonably well for some people and quietly destroyed others, and produced a great deal of suppression and longing and unspoken misery that the 1960s was in no mood to continue pretending was fine. The free love movement drew from several intellectual streams that sounded very convincing in a coffee shop at midnight. Wilhelm Reich argued that sexual repression was the root of authoritarian politics, that a society that punished desire was a society that could manufacture obedient, fearful citizens who would support authoritarian structures because they had already submitted to authority in their most intimate selves. Utopian communes of the 19th century, like the Oneida community in upstate New York, had experimented with what they called complex marriage, non-exclusive relationships within a community, and had survived for decades. And there was the more general sense, shared widely among young people in the 60s, that the rules around relationships were just more arbitrary rules imposed by a society that had proven itself untrustworthy in so many other areas. Why would you trust its views on love? The theory was generous and optimistic and, in its best articulation, genuinely radical. Love was not a finite resource to be hoarded and allocated through contracts and certificates. It could be extended freely to many people without diminishing. Jealousy was a learned behaviour, a product of a conditioning that told you another person's affection was something you could own and could lose. Community bonds could supplement or replace the exclusive pair bond, distributing emotional support across a group rather than concentrating it between two people who were then expected to be everything to each other. These were not unreasonable ideas. They were also significantly harder to live out in practice than they were to articulate on paper, or at a meeting, or in the persuasive voice of someone who had not yet tried them. Because it turned out, and this will not surprise you, that jealousy was not entirely a learned behaviour. It was also, in part, a feeling that arrived without asking permission, regardless of how many meetings you had attended about its social construction. And that sharing a small farmhouse with a person who was also in a relationship with your partner introduced a particular kind of social complexity that no amount of ideology fully dissolved. People got hurt. People pretended not to be hurt because being hurt was supposed to indicate insufficient enlightenment. People who were pretending not to be hurt became very quietly angry, and the anger tended to come out sideways, in disagreements about the chore chart, in pointed remarks at dinner, in the kind of communal tension that made the salt argument about salt seem almost refreshing by comparison. The free love ideal produced real changes in how Americans thought about sexuality and relationships. It cracked open a conversation that the culture had been refusing to have for generations. But the lived reality was more complicated than the theory, as lived realities tend to be. The people who navigated it best were usually the ones who had replaced ideology with honesty, who talked to each other, who admitted when they were hurt, who treated their relationships as something requiring constant attention rather than a declaration of principle, which was, in the end, more or less what the previous generation had been doing, just with different furniture and considerably better music. Let's talk about what it actually felt like to live on a commune, because the fantasy version involves sunlit fields and cooperative harmony, and people weaving baskets while someone plays acoustic guitar nearby, and the vegetables practically grow themselves out of pure goodwill. And that was sometimes real. But so was the meeting about the dishes. You're on a commune in rural Vermont or New Mexico or Northern California in 1968, and this morning's agenda includes watering the garden, fixing the fence the goat got through again, splitting wood for the evening fire, and the meeting. The meeting is where the commune makes collective decisions about how to run itself, and it operates on a principle of consensus. Everyone must agree before anything can be decided. This is a beautiful principle. It is also a principle that turns the question of whether to buy a second wheelbarrow into a 2-hour conversation, at the end of which everyone has learned a great deal about each other's feelings about ownership and labour, and still no one has fixed the fence. Communes in the 1960s ranged enormously, from highly organised intentional communities with clear structures, shared work schedules, and real infrastructure, to loose collections of people sharing a rented farmhouse with a vague agreement to be kind to each other and see what happened. At the organised end of the spectrum were places like the farm in Tennessee, founded in 1971 by Stephen Gaskin, and several hundred followers who had driven cross-country from San Francisco in a caravan of school buses. The farm developed genuine institutional life, a midwifery program that delivered thousands of babies and trained midwives who spread across the country, a publishing house, a working farm that fed the community, a school. It was serious, committed, demanding work, and it survived because the people doing it treated collective living as a skill to be learned rather than an attitude to be adopted. At the less organised end were the communities that operated on enthusiasm alone, and these followed a fairly predictable arc. Phase 1. Everyone arrives full of excitement and goodwill. There is music every evening. Strangers become friends with extraordinary speed. The garden is planted with more vegetables than anyone has thought carefully about how to prepare. The phrase "we're family now" is said with genuine feeling. Phase 2. It becomes gradually apparent that enthusiasm does not distribute labour evenly. Some people are cooking every day. Some people are philosophizing every day. The people who are cooking begin to notice, with growing precision, exactly who is philosophizing. Phase 3. A meeting is called about the dishes specifically. This meeting lasts 3 hours. Nothing is resolved. Someone makes a chore chart. The chore chart is described by 2 people as a tool of hierarchical oppression. The chore chart disappears within a week. The children raised in communes had experiences that were, by many accounts, genuinely wonderful in some ways and genuinely difficult in others. They had enormous freedom, acres of land to explore, dozens of adults paying them attention, a childhood spent outside and in community. They also had instability, interrupted schooling, food insecurity in the lean periods, and the particular emotional complexity of growing up among adults who were conducting an ongoing experiment in human relations. Some of those children have written memoirs. The memoirs are fascinating, and they are not uniformly positive, but they are also not uniformly negative, which itself says something about the complexity of what the communes actually were. Not utopia, not disaster, but something more interesting and more human than either. Let's talk about Vietnam, because you cannot tell the story of the 1960s counterculture without understanding that hovering over all of it, the music, the communes, the love-ins, the flower children in their embroidered jeans, was the war. Not as an abstraction, not as something happening far away to other people who are not you, as an immediate, personal, terrifying reality for every young man in America between the ages of 18 and 26, which is to say, for the precise demographic at the centre of the counterculture. You could be drafted, your number could come up, and if it did, you would be sent to a jungle on the other side of the world to fight a war that was growing harder to explain, harder to justify, and harder to win with every passing month of every passing year. The draft lottery, introduced in 1969, meant that your fate could literally be determined by your birthday, a number pulled from a container that could send you to graduate school with a high number or send you to the Mekong Delta with a low one. The randomness of this was deeply destabilizing. It was not like the World War II draft, which had carried with it a relatively broad social consensus that the cause was just. Vietnam produced no such consensus, and the draft produced only the certainty of personal risk attached to a war that a growing number of the people being drafted did not believe in. The inequalities in the system sharpened the anger. Student deferments meant that if you were enrolled in college, you were temporarily protected, which meant that the children of families who could afford college were temporarily protected, and the children of families who could not were not. Medical deferments required documentation and access to doctors, which again favoured the middle class. The National Guard and Reserve units were heavily subscribed by men with connections who were trying to fulfil their service obligation without deploying to Southeast Asia, a fact that was widely understood and quietly resented. Poor Americans and black Americans in disproportionate numbers were fighting and dying in a war that the more privileged members of their generation were avoiding. This was not a secret. It was math, and it was visible, and it made the counterculture's relationship to the war simultaneously about principle and about survival. The images coming back from Vietnam were unlike anything Americans had seen before, and this was new. This was the first televised war, and it looked nothing like the heroic narratives that Hollywood and the official government had been producing about American military intervention. The photographs and footage showed napalm and burning villages and American soldiers who looked tired and frightened and not entirely certain what they were supposed to be accomplishing. The My Lai massacre, in which American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians in March of 1968, was reported in November of '69, and the response was a national crisis of conscience. For young people who were already sceptical of authority, already suspicious of the gap between the official story and the visible reality, Vietnam became the central piece of evidence in a case that was already well underway. The people in charge were not telling the truth. The war was wrong. And the correct response to a wrong war conducted by people who were lying about it was not compliance. This was not a fringe position by 1969. It was the majority view among Americans under 30, and it was gaining ground among Americans over 30 every time the casualty figures were updated. The war made everything more urgent because it made the stakes completely clear. Let's talk about protest, which in the 1960s was elevated from a civic activity to an art form, a spiritual practice, and in some cases a form of performance theatre sophisticated enough to make Andy Warhol take notes. You're at a march in Washington, D.C. in 1969, the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam, and there are more people around you than you have ever seen in your life. The official estimates will put the crowd at 500,000. The unofficial estimates are higher. The National Mall is a sea of people, and somewhere up ahead, too far to see clearly, someone is speaking into a microphone, and the sound is rolling back through the crowd in waves, and the people around you are nodding and crying and holding signs that range from carefully lettered political statements to hand-painted doves to one man's sign which simply reads, in block letters, "Enough." The 1960s produced some of the most effective and influential protest tactics in American history, many of them inherited from the civil rights movement, which had been developing and refining them since the early years of the decade. The sit-in which protesters occupied a space peacefully and refused to leave, was perfected at the Greensboro lunch counter in February of 1960, when 4 black college students sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter that served only white customers and simply did not leave. They were harassed and threatened, and they did not leave. The next day, more students came. Within weeks, the tactic had spread to dozens of cities. The power of it was its simplicity. You occupy the space where injustice is happening, and you make the injustice visible by being present, calmly and persistently, at its exact location. The anti-war movement adapted and expanded this toolkit. The teach-in emerged in 1965 at the University of Michigan, an all-night event in which faculty and students talked about the war, its history, its costs, its contradictions, replacing normal class time with the specific kind of education that the curriculum was not providing. It spread to campuses across the country within months. The march, the rally, the vigil, the demonstration outside the induction centre where young men were being drafted, each of these was a form of communication, a way of making visible a dissent that the normal channels of democratic participation were failing to register or respond to. Draft card burning was something else, a direct act of civil disobedience rather than a demonstration. Congress made it a federal crime in 1965 to knowingly destroy or mutilate a draft card, which meant that every young man who burned his card in public was committing a federal offence in full view of cameras and crowds, making a statement that he was willing to face prosecution rather than participate in a war he believed was wrong. Some went to prison, some fled to Canada, where a community of American draft resistors built lives in Toronto and Vancouver, and dozens of smaller cities, many of them never returning. Some applied for conscientious objector status, a legal process that required demonstrating sincere religious or moral objection to all war, not just this war, and which was granted rarely and begrudgingly. The protest worked, and they did not work, in the complicated way that protest always works and does not work. They did not end the war immediately. They did not transform the government overnight. But they changed the political atmosphere in ways that were real and measurable. They kept the cost of the war visible. They made supporting the war politically expensive. They created the sustained domestic pressure that, combined with military reality on the ground in Vietnam, eventually made continued American involvement impossible to maintain. The enough sign was not wrong. It just took longer than the person holding it had hoped. Let's talk about LSD, because it is impossible to talk about the 1960s counterculture honestly without it, and also because the story of how a laboratory chemical, synthesized by a Swiss chemist in 1938, ended up in the punch bowl at a house party in San Francisco, and then somehow changed. American culture is one of the genuinely stranger chains of causality that history has to offer. Albert Hofmann synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide at Sandoz Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland in 1938, and did not immediately appreciate what he had made, partly because he did not experience its effects until 1943, when he accidentally absorbed a small amount through his fingertips and had an unexpectedly eventful bicycle ride home. He described the experience in his lab notes with the careful precision of a scientist and the barely contained astonishment of a man who has just discovered that reality has more rooms in it than the floor plan suggested. Sandoz marketed it as a research chemical, and for the next decade and a half it was studied by psychiatrists and psychologists who believed it might have genuine therapeutic value, that it could help patients access emotional material that ordinary consciousness kept locked away, that it could treat alcoholism and anxiety, and the kind of deep psychological suffering that talking cures reached only slowly. The research was serious and the early results were interesting, and then the CIA got involved, which is where things became considerably less serious and considerably more alarming. The MKUltra program, which ran through the 1950s and early 60s, dosed unwitting subjects, including soldiers, prisoners, and mental patients, with LSD in an attempt to develop techniques for mind control and interrogation. This was not a rumour or a conspiracy theory. It was a documented government program that was eventually exposed, and it produced lawsuits and congressional hearings and a level of institutional embarrassment that was richly deserved. Timothy Leary was a Harvard psychologist who encountered psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico in 1960 and proceeded to spend the next several decades as either a prophet of consciousness expansion or an extremely charismatic man having a prolonged public breakdown, depending on your perspective, and possibly both simultaneously. His formula, turn on, tune in, drop out, became one of the defining slogans of the era. Turn on meant activate your consciousness through psychedelics. Tune in meant bring that expanded consciousness into engaged relationship with the world around you. Drop out meant detach from automatic compulsive behavior, from the unconscious obedience to social norms that most people accepted without examining. Nixon reportedly called Leary the most dangerous man in America, which Leary took as a compliment and which Nixon meant as an instruction. In the Haight, LSD was initially legal in California until 1968, and it circulated freely at concerts and gatherings and in the communal houses of Haight-Ashbury. The Grateful Dead's extended improvisational performances were designed, in part, as musical environments for people who were navigating an altered relationship with time, where a single chord change could feel like a landscape, where the space between notes was as important as the notes themselves, where the music and the listener and the room became briefly indistinguishable from each other. Whether you experienced this chemically or not, the music reached for something real, for the feeling that ordinary boundaries were more permeable than they appeared, that the self was less fixed than it felt, that reality was something you participated in rather than something that happened to you. These are not unreasonable ideas. They are in fact ideas with a long philosophical pedigree. The 1960s simply found a very fast and unpredictable shortcut to them, and then everyone had to figure out what to do with what they found when they got there. Let's talk about race, because the story of the 1960s counterculture cannot be told honestly without acknowledging its complicated relationship with the civil rights movement, a relationship that was sometimes deeply supportive, sometimes appropriative, sometimes oblivious, and always shaped by the profound inequality that ran through American society like a fault line you could see from space if you were paying attention, which not everyone was. The civil rights movement preceded the hippie counterculture, and in many ways made it possible. The courage and strategy and moral clarity of the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the Birmingham campaign, the March on Washington, these demonstrated that ordinary people, refusing to accept an unjust status quo, could move the most powerful country in the world. The hippies inherited that example. They borrowed its tactics, the non-violence, the communal singing, the willingness to occupy space and accept the legal consequences. They shared its suspicion of official authority and its belief that the America of the civics textbooks was not the America of lived experience. Many white students who would go on to join the counterculture had their political awakening through civil rights work, going south to register voters with SNCC, sitting in at lunch counters, joining the freedom rides. These experiences did something that no amount of reading or theorizing could replicate. They made the reality of American racism visceral and personal and impossible to set aside. Young white students who had grown up in the relative comfort of the post-war suburbs found themselves in Mississippi jails or watching fire hoses turned on peaceful marchers, and something changed in them that did not change back. They returned to their campuses radicalized, not just sympathetic to the struggle for black equality, but fundamentally suspicious of every institution and authority that had produced and maintained the system they had just seen up close. But the counterculture also had real and significant failures around race. The Summer of Love was overwhelmingly white, taking place in a neighborhood that had largely displaced its black residents as rents rose, and the district transformed into a destination for white young people from across the country. This was gentrification, and it happened to a neighborhood that had been, not long before, home to a black working-class community, and the counterculture's celebration of Haight-Ashbury, as a liberated space, did not spend much time acknowledging this. The music the counterculture celebrated, rock and roll, blues, jazz, was rooted in black American culture, in the specific experiences and genius of black musicians who had created these forms, but the commercial benefits and the cultural visibility flowed disproportionately toward white artists and white audiences. Janis Joplin's debt to Bessie Smith was real, and Joplin acknowledged it, but Bessie Smith was not on the cover of Life magazine. The peace and love rhetoric also sometimes obscured the specific material demands of the black freedom movement. Flower power was a beautiful idea, but it did not pass the Voting Rights Act. It did not integrate the schools. It did not address the economic inequality that kept black Americans in poverty, regardless of the formal legal changes that had been won. The Black Power movement, which emerged in the late 60s as a response to the limits of integrationist politics, looked at the white counterculture's spiritual individualism and saw, in some cases, a movement that had the luxury of pursuing enlightenment because it was not simultaneously fighting for basic survival. That tension was real, and the counterculture's most honest participants acknowledged it, even when acknowledging it was uncomfortable. Discomfort, as it turned out, was not something the counterculture was always as willing to sit with as it claimed. Let's talk about the women of the counterculture, because their story is one of the more quietly complicated threads in this whole tapestry. And quietly complicated is a phrase that undersells it considerably. On the surface, the counterculture presented itself as a space of liberation from all the old rules, all the old hierarchies, all the constrictive roles that conventional American society had assigned to everyone. And for women arriving in Haight-Ashbury or joining communes or attending rallies in the mid to late 1960s, there was initially a genuine sense of expanded possibility. The rigid expectations of 50s femininity, the immaculate housewife, the suburban mother, the woman whose ambitions had a ceiling approximately as high as the kitchen cabinet, those expectations were being openly rejected. Women could travel, speak publicly, live communally, have sexual lives outside the narrow boundaries of marriage. They could wear what they wanted, say what they thought, reject the whole carefully choreographed performance of femininity that the previous generation had been required to maintain daily. This was real, and it mattered, and it was not nothing. But here is the but, and it is a significant one. As women in the counterculture very quickly discovered, opting out of mainstream society's gender rules did not automatically produce gender equality. it frequently just produced a different set of expectations with better music and worse plumbing. The communes and collectives, which were run by consensus and committed in principle to non-hierarchical organisation, had a persistent and embarrassing tendency to sort labour along entirely traditional gender lines. Women cooked, women cleaned, women managed the children, the emotional atmosphere of the community, the care of the sick, the maintenance of the relationships that held the group together. Men philosophised, men played music, men made the political decisions and then explained them at length at meetings that ran past midnight. This was not always the result of conscious intention. It was the result of patterns so deeply embedded in everyone involved that they reproduced themselves even in communities that had explicitly rejected them. A woman who noticed this and named it was told sometimes that she was being divisive, that pointing out inequity within the movement was a distraction from the more important fight against the system outside it. This argument, which essentially asked women to set aside their own liberation until the male-defined revolution was complete, was not a new argument. It had been made to women in every radical movement in American history, going back to the abolitionists who told the suffragists to wait their turn. The women of the counterculture, to their considerable credit, did not wait. The feminist consciousness that grew within and around the counterculture in the late 1960s became the engine of second-wave feminism, the movement that produced the National Organization for Women, the Women's Liberation Movement, the campaigns for reproductive rights and equal pay, and an end to legal discrimination. Women who had been told to make the coffee at SDS meetings started their own organisations. Women who had been valued primarily for their availability and their domestic labour began writing and speaking and organising around the specific conditions of women's lives. Consciousness-raising groups met in living rooms across the country, small circles of women naming their experiences and discovering that what they had each assumed was a personal problem was in fact a political condition shared by millions. This was, in its way, the counterculture's most lasting and most radical contribution, not the music, not the communes, but the quiet, furious conversations that women were having among themselves while the men were on stage. Let's talk about the Grateful Dead, because they deserve their own segment, partly because of their musical significance, and partly because what they created was genuinely unlike anything that existed before or has quite existed since. A band that was less a band than a travelling communal experiment, a decades-long negotiation between improvisation and structure, and a case study in how a group of people with a particular vision can, if they are stubborn enough and talented enough and occasionally lucky enough, build their own entire universe. The Grateful Dead formed in San Francisco in 1965, growing out of the Palo Alto jug band and folk scenes, and from the beginning they were operating with different assumptions than most rock bands. Where other bands rehearsed songs to a polished finish and performed those finished songs the same way every night, the Dead approached their concerts as improvisational events, in which the song was not the destination but the starting point. A performance of Dark Star might last 12 minutes or 45 minutes, depending entirely on where it went on any given evening. This was either exhilarating or maddening, depending on whether you were a deadhead or a venue manager trying to keep to a schedule. Their approach drew from jazz, from the tradition of musicians communicating in real time, following each other through changes that were not predetermined, building something collectively that none of them could have built alone. Jerry Garcia, the band's lead guitarist, was a devoted student of bluegrass and old-time music as well as rock, and he brought to his playing a melodic sensibility that was unusually warm and searching. His solos did not show off so much as they explored, moving through keys and feelings with the quality of someone following a thought to wherever it led. The other members, Bob Weir, Phil Lesh, Mickey Hart and Bill Kreutzmann on drums, and for years Ron McKernan and later Keith Godchaux on keyboards, Each contributed something distinctive, and the combination produced a sound that was recognizable immediately and endlessly variable. Their audience, the Deadheads, became one of the most extraordinary fan communities in the history of popular music, and the word fan barely covers it. Some followed the band from city to city for seasons at a time, financing the journey by selling handmade clothing and jewellery and food in the parking lots outside venues, the shakedown street economy, named after a Dead song, a self-sustaining informal market that sprang up before every show. People lived in vans and converted school buses, moving with the band across the country in what was essentially a travelling village. They traded bootleg recordings of concerts obsessively, comparing performances, debating set lists, maintaining an oral and written history of the band's evolution that was as detailed and serious as any academic archive. The Dead themselves encouraged this. They were the first major band to explicitly allow audience members to record their shows, setting up a designated taping section near the soundboard. This was counterintuitive from a commercial standpoint. Why let people record something you could sell? And it was right, because it meant that the music circulated freely, reached people who could not afford concert tickets, built a community of listeners who felt a relationship to the music rather than merely a transaction with it. The concerts were not products to be consumed and discarded. They were events to be attended, experienced, remembered, and shared. In this the Dead were, without quite intending to be, a working model of the counterculture's deepest values: community over commerce, experience over ownership, the journey over the destination. They kept touring until Garcia's death in 1995. The village dissolved, but the recordings remain, thousands of them, every night's experiment preserved and catalogued, the longest and strangest musical diary in American history. Let's talk about Woodstock. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair took place over 3 days in August of 1969 on a dairy farm in Bethel, New York. Not Woodstock, technically, because the original venue fell through and the organisers moved it at the last minute, which should give you some indication of how the weekend's planning was going. The organisers expected maybe 50,000 people. Approximately 400,000 showed up. The New York State Thruway was closed. Traffic backed up for miles in every direction. People abandoned their cars on the highway and walked the rest of the way, which was anywhere between 10 and 20 miles depending on where they managed to stop, carrying whatever they had thought to bring, which in many cases was not very much. A sleeping bag, maybe. Good intentions, definitely. An awareness that something important was happening and a determination to be physically present for it, even if that presence involved walking several miles in sandals on a highway median in August. You arrive at Woodstock on Friday, August 15th, 1969, and the first thing you notice is that the fences are gone. There were supposed to be fences. This was a ticketed event, $3 a day or $18 for the weekend. But there were so many people arriving simultaneously that the fences were simply removed, because the alternative was something worse than a lost revenue stream, and no one wanted that. Everything is free now, whether it was meant to be or not. The music, the camping, the food that the Hog Farm Collective is somehow distributing from the back of trucks, despite having absolutely no mandate to feed 400,000 people. The Hog Farm, led by Wavy Gravy, which was his actual name, legally, had been brought in to handle security, which they approached not with force but with gentle absurdity. When someone was having a bad drug experience, the Hog Farm ran a police force tent staffed by calm, experienced people whose job was to sit with the person, talk them through it, and remind them that what they were experiencing was temporary and not the permanent new nature of reality, however convincing it might feel at the moment. The lineup was extraordinary by any measure. Janis Joplin, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Joe Cocker, Santana, Sly and the Family Stone, Joan Baez, Country Joe and the Fish, and on Monday morning as the crowd thinned, Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix closed the festival with a set that included a version of the Star-Spangled Banner, performed on electric guitar alone, a version that used feedback and distortion to make the national anthem sound like a war zone, which was either the most patriotic or the most anti-patriotic thing ever done with that melody. And the correct answer is that it was both, simultaneously, and that this ambiguity was precisely the point. It rained on the second day. The farm became a mudfield of extraordinary depth and commitment. People slid down hills in the mud. People danced in the mud. People lost their shoes in the mud and kept going barefoot, which at this point was practically the festival's dress code anyway. There were 2 deaths, one from a heroin overdose, one when a man sleeping in his sleeping bag was run over by a tractor in the early morning, and 2 births and 1 appendectomy performed in a medical tent. The organisers went bankrupt. Max Yazgur, the dairy farmer who had rented his land for the festival, became briefly famous for saying that 500,000 young people had demonstrated to the world that they could come together in peace. He was right, and he was also, practically speaking, left with a field that would take considerable time to recover. Woodstock became a myth almost instantly, which is what happens when something that should not have worked, works, and 400,000 people are there to witness it. Let's talk about the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, because it is one of the most interesting things to come out of the Summer of Love, and also because it is a reminder that even the most idealistic movements eventually encounter the reality that people get sick, people get hurt, and someone has to figure out how to provide care when the existing system is either unwilling or unable to do so. By the summer of 1967, Haight-Ashbury had a genuine public health crisis on its hands, not the kind that gets dramatic coverage, but the slow, grinding kind that accumulates when you put tens of thousands of young people with no money, insufficient food, and inadequate shelter in a neighbourhood that was not built to receive them, and then add a significant amount of drug use happening without any medical safety net whatsoever. The established medical system was poorly configured to help. Emergency rooms were not sure how to treat a bad LSD experience, which was not like any other medical emergency they'd been trained to handle. It did not respond to standard psychiatric protocols in standard ways, and the patients themselves were deeply reluctant to go to emergency rooms because they feared being arrested, being hospitalized against their will, being reported to authorities, or simply being treated with the contempt that many mainstream medical professionals made no effort to conceal when confronted with a young person in tie-dye who had taken too much of something and was now insisting that the walls were breathing. The fear was not irrational. The contempt was real. Dr. David Smith was a young physician and pharmacologist at the University of California, San Francisco, who had been paying attention to what was happening in Haight-Ashbury with the specific attention of someone who understood both the pharmacology and the social dynamics at play. On June 6, 1967, he opened the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic in a storefront on Clayton Street. Free meant free, no payment, no insurance required, no questions about immigration status or legal history, no judgment about lifestyle. The clinic would see whoever walked through the door, and in the summer of 67, a great many people walked through the door. Staff learned rapidly, developing expertise in drug-related care that did not yet exist in any formal medical literature, because the medical establishment had not yet caught up with what was happening in the streets. They learned how to talk someone through a bad trip calmly, without restraint or chemical intervention where possible, using presence and reassurance rather than force. They learned the specific presentations of amphetamine psychosis and heroin overdose, and the infections that came from shared needles. They treated the malnutrition and the respiratory infections and the injuries that came with the lifestyle, and they did it all without asking their patients to be someone other than who they were. The clinic was not just a medical facility, it was proof of concept, evidence that a community could organise to provide for its own members' needs without waiting for institutions to catch up, that care could be offered on terms of dignity rather than transaction. It survived the summer of love, survived the end of the counterculture, and kept going. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic is still operating today, still providing free and low-cost medical care in San Francisco, still committed to the principle that access to healthcare should not depend on ability to pay. That principle, self-evident to some and deeply contested to others, was radical in 1967. The debate has not entirely resolved itself since, which is less a comment on the counterculture and more a comment on the remarkable durability of certain arguments. Let's talk about the Black Panther Party, because they were the counterculture's most important contemporaries, and also, in many ways, its mirror image, its conscience, and the movement that most clearly exposed the difference between opting out of a system and being excluded from it in ways you had no choice about. Founded in Oakland, California, in October of 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the Panthers represented a different response to the same broken America that the hippies were trying to transform through peace and love and collective living. Where the hippie counterculture largely came from white, middle-class backgrounds and had the luxury of choosing to opt out, of dropping out of school, of leaving jobs, of retreating to rural communes when the city felt like too much. The Black Panther Party was founded by people who had no such option, who were living directly and daily under the heel of the systems that the counterculture was critiquing from a position of relative safety. The Panthers' 10-point program was specific where the counterculture was general, concrete where flower power was symbolic. They wanted full employment, decent housing, quality education, an end to police brutality, exemption of black men from military service in a war being fought disproportionately by black soldiers, and the freedom of all black men held in prisons. These were not spiritual aspirations. They were demands, addressed to specific institutions, backed by the threat of organised resistance. The Panthers dressed in black leather and berets and carried shotguns through the streets of Oakland, legally exercising their Second Amendment rights with a deliberateness that was both a political statement and a direct challenge to the police who'd been brutalising Black Oakland residents for years with near-total impunity. The free breakfast program was perhaps the Panthers' most remarkable achievement and their most effective piece of political theatre, though calling it theatre does not do justice to the reality that it fed thousands of children. Every morning, in church basements and community centres in cities across the country, Panther volunteers cooked and served free hot breakfast to children before school. They fed tens of thousands of kids who would otherwise have gone to school hungry, and they did it before the federal government had any meaningful school breakfast program in place. The program was so effective that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI identified it as one of the most dangerous Panther activities, dangerous because it demonstrated concretely and publicly the gap between what the government was providing to its black citizens and what a community organisation with minimal resources could provide when it decided to. Ronald Reagan, then Governor of California, pushed through the Mulford Act in 1967, specifically to disarm the Panthers, emergency gun control legislation that prohibited the public carrying of loaded firearms, passed in direct response to Panther patrols, and signed into law while a group of armed Panthers stood in the gallery of the state legislature to observe. The white counterculture watched all of this, and responses varied. Some, particularly those who had come through the civil rights movement, understood deeply what the Panthers were doing and why. Others maintained a comfortable distance, offering solidarity in the abstract while remaining in their communes and their music scenes, insulated by race and class from the specific violence the Panthers were organised to confront. The gap between those two positions was not a gap in goodwill. It was a gap in stakes, and the Panthers were acutely aware of it. Let's talk about the government's response to the counterculture, which can be summarised fairly accurately as extremely stressed, legally creative, occasionally self-defeating, and marked throughout by the specific quality of institutional panic that sets in when the people in charge realise that the usual tools of social control are not producing the usual results. By the late 1960s, the Nixon administration had identified the anti-war movement and the counterculture as threats requiring active suppression rather than passive management, and it was prepared to deploy the full resources of the federal government accordingly. The FBI's COINTELPRO program, counterintelligence program, had been running since the mid-50s, but it expanded dramatically in the late 60s to target anti-war organisations, black power groups, and counterculture figures with a menu of tactics that range from legally questionable to plainly illegal. COINTELPRO wiretapped phones without warrants. It placed informants inside organisations. It sent anonymous letters designed to create distrust between movement leaders, forged documents that accused individuals of being government informants, fabricated evidence of affairs or financial impropriety, poisoned pen correspondence crafted to destroy alliances that the FBI found threatening. It worked, sometimes. Organisations fractured over suspicions that turned out to be planted. Leaders were discredited by accusations that had been manufactured. The program was not revealed publicly until 1971, when activists broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, stole files, and distributed them to journalists, which is either the most heroic or the most reckless act of the entire era, and is probably both. The revelation produced public outrage, congressional investigations, and the eventual formal termination of the program, though not before it had done considerable damage. The trial of the Chicago 7 was the most theatrical expression of the government's attempt to use the legal system against the counterculture. 8 people were originally indicted. The 8th was Black Panther co-founder Bobby Seale, for conspiracy and crossing state lines to incite a riot, based on their involvement in protests at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The protests had been met with police violence so excessive and so visible, broadcast on live television, that the official inquiry afterward described it as a police riot. The decision to prosecute the protesters rather than the police was a choice that revealed something about priorities, and the defendants were not inclined to let it pass quietly. Judge Julius Hoffman presided, and the mismatch between the courtroom's expectations of decorum and the defendants' intentions was immediate and sustained. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, the Yippie leaders among the defendants, treated the proceedings as political theatre, making speeches, citing the Declaration of Independence, showing up one day in judicial robes, maintaining throughout a cheerful contempt for the proceedings that the judge found maddening and that the press found irresistible. Bobby Seale, denied his requested attorney and ordered to proceed without adequate representation, continued to protest from the defense table until Judge Hoffman ordered him bound to his chair and gagged, an image that appeared in newspapers across the country and raised, somewhat urgently, questions about the nature of American justice. Seale's case was eventually severed from the others. All remaining defendants were acquitted on the conspiracy charge. Several were convicted on lesser charges that were later overturned on appeal. The government had spent enormous resources trying to make an example of people who had proven considerably better at generating sympathetic press coverage than at inciting riots. It was not the outcome the prosecution had intended, which was, in its way, entirely fitting. Let's talk about the environment, because one of the counterculture's most lasting and least celebrated contributions to American life was its role in the birth of the modern environmental movement, a contribution that is easy to overlook because environmentalism has since become mainstream enough that it is difficult to remember how recently it was considered eccentric, and how much work went into making the case that the Earth was worth protecting in terms that political institutions could act on. In the early 1960s, The idea that human industrial activity was seriously and systematically damaging the natural world, and that this damage required urgent political response, was not a consensus view. It was the position of scientists and naturalists, and people who spent a lot of time in forests and rivers and had noticed, with growing alarm, that the forests and rivers were in trouble. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, was the document that changed this, at least intellectually. Carson was a marine biologist and nature writer who spent years researching the effects of synthetic pesticides, particularly DDT, on bird populations, on ecosystems, and ultimately on human health. What she found, and what she described in prose of unusual clarity and beauty, was a cascade of damage: eagles with thinning eggshells, robins dying on suburban lawns, the food chain concentrating toxins upward until they reached levels that were measurable in human breast milk. Silent Spring was a scientific argument and a moral one simultaneously, and it produced the specific combination of fury and defensiveness from the chemical industry that indicates you have hit something true. The industry attacked Carson personally, questioned her credentials, dismissed her findings, and in doing so accidentally demonstrated exactly the relationship between corporate interest and public health that she'd described. The counterculture amplified Carson's message and connected it to its broader critique of industrial capitalism. The Back to the Land movement brought young people into direct relationship with the natural world in ways that made the degradation of that world personal. You could not grow food in contaminated soil without noticing the contamination, could not drink from a polluted stream without understanding what pollution meant in your own body, could not watch a river catch fire and feel that this was normal or acceptable. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire in June of 1969, not for the first time, but visibly enough this time that photographs circulated nationally and produced an eruption of public outrage. The image of a river on fire was a kind of limit case, a demonstration that something had gone very wrong, expressed in terms so literal and so dramatic that even people who had not been paying attention could not miss it. The first Earth Day was April 22nd, 1970, and 20 million Americans participated in teach-ins, rallies, park cleanups, and demonstrations in cities and towns across the country. It was the largest civic event in American history to that point. Senator Gaylord Nelson, who organized it, had been directly inspired by the anti-war teach-ins, borrowing the format and the energy of the counterculture's protest tradition and directing it at a different target. The Environmental Protection Agency was established later that year. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act followed in the early 70s. Legislation with real teeth that produced measurable improvements in air and water quality over the subsequent decades. The counterculture did not write these laws. Politicians and lawyers and scientists wrote them. But the counterculture created the cultural and political atmosphere in which passing them was possible, by insisting loudly and persistently, and in terms that went beyond mere policy into something closer to moral conviction, that the earth was not an input to be consumed but a living system to be honoured, that the river should not be on fire, that this should not be a controversial position. Let's talk about the Whole Earth Catalogue, which was a magazine-sized publication that appeared in 1968 and managed to be simultaneously a mail-order catalogue, a philosophical manifesto, an encyclopedia of practical knowledge, and an early version of an idea that would not fully arrive for another 30 years. Stuart Brand, who had been present at many of the key moments of the San Francisco counterculture, he had worked with Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters and helped organize the Trips Festival, one of the early large-scale psychedelic gatherings that prefigured the Summer of Love, launched the Whole Earth Catalogue with a premise that sounds simple and turned out to be revolutionary. People needed access to tools, and tools in this context meant not just physical implements, but books, ideas, techniques, and ways of thinking that the existing systems of education and commerce were either not providing or were actively gatekeeping behind credentials and costs that most people could not meet. The catalogue's full title was the Whole Earth Catalogue, Access to Tools, and that word access was doing a great deal of work. The counterculture had produced a significant population of young people who had left conventional life and needed to figure out how to live differently, practically on the ground, how to build a house, grow food through winter, repair an engine, deliver a baby, generate electricity from a stream, treat an infection without a doctor, educate children without a school. These were not small questions. They were the daily survival questions of tens of thousands of people who had moved to rural land with enormous idealism and a skill set largely oriented toward the kinds of things you learned in college, which did not typically include carpentry or animal husbandry. Brand organised the catalogue by category, shelter, craft, learning, community, nomadics, whole systems, and within each category reviewed and recommended specific resources with a directness and enthusiasm that felt completely unlike anything in the conventional consumer press. He was not trying to sell you things you did not need. He was trying to connect you with things that would genuinely help you do what you were trying to do, and he brought the same intellectual seriousness to recommending a hand tool as to recommending a book about Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome structures, which appeared frequently and with evident admiration. Fuller himself was something of a patron saint of the catalogue's worldview. The idea that intelligent design could solve practical problems elegantly, that understanding systems allowed you to work with them rather than against them, that the resources of the earth were sufficient if distributed with intelligence, rather than wasted through the friction of bad design. The catalogue ran in various editions until 1972, with a final edition in 1974, and it sold over 1 million copies. It won the National Book Award. It was passed from hand to hand on communes and in workshops, and in the early computer science departments of California universities, where a generation of young engineers was beginning to think about computing in terms that the catalogue had helped shape. The idea that technology was most powerful when it was accessible to individuals, when it could be understood and modified and built upon by the people using it, rather than locked inside institutions. The personal computer, when it arrived, was in many ways the Whole Earth Catalogue made digital. The same faith in individual empowerment through access to tools, expressed in a new medium. Steve Jobs understood this and said so publicly. The line from the hate to Silicon Valley is not straight and it is not simple, but it runs through this catalogue, through this idea that access to knowledge was a form of freedom, and that freedom was something you could build with your hands. Let's talk about the end of things, because every story that begins with a summer of love eventually has to reckon with a different kind of weather, and the end of the 1960s had two events that, taken together, did something to the counterculture's sense of itself that it never fully recovered from. The first was Altamont. The Altamont Speedway Free concert took place in December of 1969, 4 months after Woodstock, at a racetrack outside San Francisco, organised quickly by the Rolling Stones as a free concert to close out their American tour. The logistics were disastrous from the start. The venue was chosen and changed multiple times in the final weeks. The Grateful Dead, who were supposed to play, pulled out when they heard how badly things were going on the ground. The stage was too low, surrounded by the crowd on all sides, with no real security perimeter. And the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was hired to provide security in exchange for $500 worth of beer, a decision that every person involved would later describe as someone else's idea. The day unravelled with a terrible logic. The Hells Angels, stationed at the edge of the low stage, moved through the crowd with pool cues and motorcycle chains, responding to perceived threats to themselves or the musicians with immediate and disproportionate violence. People were beaten throughout the day. The atmosphere grew ugly and paranoid in a way that had nothing in common with the Woodstock crowd 4 months earlier. The same generation, the same music, a completely different feeling in the air. When the Rolling Stones finally took the stage at nightfall, the situation was already past the point where music could fix it. During Sympathy for the Devil, 18-year-old Meredith Hunter, who was black, was stabbed multiple times by a Hell's Angel after appearing to draw a gun. He died in the crowd. The Stones, who could see something terrible was happening but could not see clearly what, kept playing. The documentary film crew captured most of it. Gimme Shelter, the documentary made from that footage, was released in 1970 and showed the year's end for what it was. Not just a concert gone wrong, but something that asked uncomfortable questions about the counterculture's belief in its own goodness. The idea that love and music could create a protected space, that a gathering of the right people with the right spirit could be inherently safe, had been tested at Woodstock and seemed, briefly, confirmed. Altamont unconfirmed it. It showed that a crowd was a crowd, that the same conditions that could produce Woodstock's remarkable collective generosity could, with different logistics and different actors, produce something that looked much more like the world the counterculture was trying to leave behind. The Manson family had already done something similar, from a different direction. Charles Manson was a failed musician and career criminal who had spent years on the fringes of the San Francisco counterculture before assembling a group of followers, mostly young women, at a ranch in the California desert. He drew on the counterculture's vocabulary, the rejection of conventional society, the search for alternative community, the language of spiritual transformation, and used it in service of something that had nothing to do with peace or love. The Tate LaBianca murders in August of 1969, carried out by Manson's followers, produced a wave of public horror that attached itself, unfairly but persistently, to the counterculture as a whole. The headlines could not entirely separate Manson's perversion of hippie aesthetics from the genuine article, and some of the public did not try very hard to make the distinction. 1969 ended with Altamont in December, and Manson's trial beginning in the summer. The flowers were wilting. The questions were getting harder. Let's talk about the moment when a counterculture stops being counter and starts becoming culture, which is, historically speaking, inevitable, and which the participants always find at least mildly devastating, even though it should never be surprising. By the early 1970s, something had begun to happen to the aesthetics and ideas of the hippie movement. They were appearing in places they had not been before, in contexts that would have seemed absurd just 5 years earlier. Tie-dye was in department stores, not underground head shops on Haight Street, but Sears, where people who had never been to a protest and had no intention of attending one could now purchase the visual vocabulary of the counterculture in a plastic-wrapped package for $12. Long hair was in television commercials. Acoustic guitars were being strummed in advertisements for insurance companies and automobiles. The language of liberation and authenticity, be yourself, follow your dreams, question the rules, you deserve more, was being absorbed by the very consumer culture that the counterculture had defined itself against. And it turned out that this language was extraordinarily, almost alarmingly, useful for selling things. This process has a name in cultural theory, co-optation or recuperation, and it is the mechanism by which every successful radical aesthetic eventually becomes a style available for purchase. It is not a conspiracy exactly. It is something more banal and more inescapable than conspiracy. It happens because the counterculture does something that genuinely changes what people want, changes their visual vocabulary, their sense of what is authentic, their idea of what it means to be an individual, and then the market, which is extraordinarily responsive to changes in what people want, produces objects and images and experiences that satisfy the new desire in a form that requires no commitment, no community, no risk, and no inconvenience. You can have the aesthetic without the politics. You can have the look without the life. You can buy the freedom instead of living it, which is both more efficient and considerably less transformative. The music was the last thing to be fully absorbed, and it was absorbed more slowly because music carries meaning in ways that a tie-dye pattern does not. The Grateful Dead could not be easily packaged. Their appeal was too dependent on the live experience, too resistant to the 3-minute format, too connected to a specific kind of patient, communal attention that commercial radio was not built to support. But the Beatles were on oldies stations by the mid-70s. Janis Joplin was being described as a legend, which is what you call someone whose work is now safe to appreciate without being required to do anything about it. The revolution had been archived. What survived the commercialization was, in some ways, more interesting than what the counterculture had explicitly claimed to be doing. The politics dissolved fastest, the explicit anti-war activism, the draft resistance, the challenge to electoral politics. The aesthetics lasted longer but became decoration. The underlying values travelled furthest and sank deepest. The suspicion of authority, the preference for authenticity over performance, the interest in environmental responsibility, the expanded tolerance for different ways of living, loving, and organising a life. These did not become products. They became assumptions, part of the background conditions of American life that the generation raised after the 60s simply inherited without knowing where they came from. The counterculture did not win on its own terms. Almost no movement does. But it changed the terms, and the new terms became the ground that everything that came after was built on, which is a different kind of victory and possibly a more durable one. Let's take stock, because the counterculture made a great deal of noise, and some of that noise faded and some of it became the background hum of modern American life in ways that are easy to miss precisely because they have become so normal that it is difficult to imagine the alternative. What did it actually change? The question is worth sitting with carefully, because both the celebratory and the dismissive answers get it wrong in similar ways, by treating the counterculture as either more unified and intentional than it was, or as more naive and ineffectual than the evidence supports. The truth is considerably more textured and considerably more interesting than either version. Start with the war. American combat involvement in Vietnam ended in 1973. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January of that year, and the last American combat troops left shortly after. This was the result of many forces, military failure on the ground, the strategic bankruptcy of the official strategy, the Nixon administration's own calculations about what was politically sustainable, but the sustained domestic pressure of the anti-war movement was a genuine part of the calculus. The movement kept the cost of the war visible in the streets and on television for years. It made the political cost of continuing the war higher than the political cost of ending it. This is not nothing. Wars do not end because they fail militarily alone. They end because the political will to continue them collapses, and the anti-war movement spent years doing the patient, unglamorous work of collapsing that will. The draft ended in 1973, replaced by an all-volunteer military, a direct consequence of the sustained resistance to conscription that the anti-war movement had maintained throughout the late 60s and early 70s. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, ratified in 1971, pushed through by the argument, made insistently by the counterculture and its allies, that if you were old enough to be drafted and sent to die in a war, you were old enough to vote on the politicians who sent you there. This was a reasonable argument, and it became law, and it extended the franchise to millions of young Americans who have been voting in every election since. The environmental legislation of the early 70s was perhaps the counterculture's most concrete and lasting policy legacy. The Environmental Protection Agency, established in December of 1970. The Clean Air Act of 1970. the Clean Water Act of 1972, the Endangered Species Act of 1973. These were not inevitable. They required political pressure, and that political pressure was generated in part by the cultural shift that the counterculture had accelerated, the growing conviction among ordinary Americans that the natural world was worth protecting, and that the government had an obligation to protect it. The air is measurably cleaner now than it was in 1969. The water in rivers that were catching fire is now swimmable. These are real changes in the physical world, and they have a history. Women's liberation, black power, gay liberation, each of these movements ran parallel to and in complex relationship with the hippie counterculture, and each produced legislative and cultural changes whose effects are still unfolding. The counterculture did not create these movements. They had their own origins, their own leadership, their own distinct analysis. But it contributed to the atmosphere of permission, the sense that existing structures were neither natural nor inevitable, that made all of them possible simultaneously. Something shifted in the 1960s, something in the collective sense of what was fixed and what was changeable, and the counterculture, for all its failures and contradictions, was part of what shifted it. Let's end here with the legacy, which is messier and more interesting than either the celebratory version or the dismissive one. The celebratory version says the hippies changed everything, that they ended a war and saved the planet and liberated humanity, and the rest is details. The dismissive version says they were naive children who grew up and became stockbrokers and left nothing behind but a few good albums and a lingering smell of patchouli in the attic. The truth is neither of those things, and it is considerably harder to wrap up tidily, which is appropriate because the counterculture was never particularly interested in things that wrapped up tidily. The hippie counterculture was large, internally contradictory, deeply sincere, often wrong-headed, occasionally brilliant, and almost always more complicated than it looked from the outside or from the distance of 50 years. It produced real changes and left real wounds. It opened doors that needed opening, and in its enthusiasm to get through them, stepped over important things, particularly around race and gender, that its stated values should have required it to take more seriously. It dreamed large and delivered unevenly, which is the characteristic condition of ambitious human projects, and is not, by itself, a reason to dismiss the dreaming. What it left behind, most durably, is a set of questions, not answers. The counterculture was better at questions than answers, and this was both its greatest weakness and its most important contribution. Questions that were not new in the 1960s, but that generation asked with a particular urgency and a particular willingness to let the answers cost them something real. Who gets to benefit from the promises of American democracy, and what happens to a democracy that does not make good on those promises? What do we owe to each other as members of a community, and how do we build communities that actually live that obligation, rather than just affirming it in principle? What is our responsibility to the natural world, and what does it mean to live in right relationship with a planet that has its own needs and limits? Can institutions be trusted, and if not, what do we build instead? You're lying in your bed tonight in a world that the counterculture helped shape. The air outside is cleaner than it would otherwise have been. The water in your tap meets standards that didn't exist in 1969. The music in your ears, the rock and soul and folk and all their descendants, carries the DNA of a transformation that happened in a neighborhood in San Francisco and spread outward until it was everywhere. The yoga studio 3 blocks away, the organic section of the grocery store, the idea that you might live your life according to your own values rather than your parents' expectations. These are not the counterculture exactly, but they carry its fingerprints, worn smooth by 50 years of handling. The questions the 60s raised are still open. Race, war, inequality, the earth, none of these have been resolved. The counterculture did not resolve them, and it would be unfair to expect it to have. What it did was make them impossible to pretend away, made them part of the permanent American conversation in a way they had not quite been before, made the denial of them require active effort rather than passive acceptance. The flowers are long gone, the commune's mostly dissolved, the music is in the elevator, but the questions remain, still open, still waiting, still as urgent as they were in the summer of 1967, when 100,000 young people descended on a neighborhood in San Francisco and tried, imperfectly and beautifully and with everything they had, to build something different. They didn't finish the job. Nobody ever does. But they moved it forward. One sunburned, barefoot, slightly idealistic step at a time. And tonight, as you drift off, that is enough to hold on to. Let's talk about God. Or more precisely, let's talk about the counterculture's complicated, enthusiastic, and frequently bewildering relationship with the divine. Because one of the things that distinguished the hippie movement from earlier American radical traditions was that it was not just politically restless, it was spiritually restless. It wanted not just a different government or a different economy, but a different cosmos, a different way of understanding what existence was for, what consciousness meant, what happened when you sat very still and paid attention to the inside of your own mind. And the tradition it had been handed, the Sunday morning Christianity of the suburban churches, the dutiful attendance and the careful sermons and the God who seemed, increasingly to be a useful buttress for exactly the social arrangements the counterculture was trying to dismantle, that tradition was not going to answer the questions the counterculture was asking. So it went looking elsewhere, and elsewhere turned out to be very far away indeed. You're in a living room in San Francisco in 1967, and there is incense burning, not the vaguely floral incense of a Catholic church, but something heavier and more specific, sandalwood or nag champa, imported from India and sitting in a brass holder on a low table next to a statue of a many-armed deity that your mother would find deeply alarming. Someone is sitting cross-legged on a cushion with their eyes closed, which they have been doing for 45 minutes, and no one finds this unusual. On the bookshelf, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, Alan Watts' The Way of Zen, Autobiography of a Yogi, and Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, which is technically a novel but is being read as a spiritual instruction manual, which is more or less how it was intended. The Western spiritual supermarket had opened for business, and the selection was extraordinary. The counterculture's turn toward Eastern religion was driven by several converging forces. The psychedelic experience had introduced a significant number of young Americans to states of consciousness that did not map onto anything in the Christian tradition they had grown up with. States of ego dissolution, of perceived unity with everything, of the self becoming briefly permeable and the boundary between inside and outside becoming genuinely uncertain. These experiences needed frameworks, and the frameworks available in Western Christianity were not built for them. But the Hindu and Buddhist traditions had been thinking about precisely these states for thousands of years. The dissolution of the ego in Vedantic philosophy. The Buddhist teaching that the self was not a fixed thing but a process, constantly arising and passing away. The Taoist idea of flowing with reality rather than imposing your will upon it like a man trying to argue with a river. For young people who had experienced something that seemed to confirm these ideas directly and personally, the Eastern traditions felt less like exotic foreign religions and more like an accurate description of something they had actually been through. Alan Watts was perhaps the most important bridge figure, a British-American philosopher who had spent decades translating Eastern philosophy into language that Western audiences could absorb, with a dry wit and a clarity that made Zen Buddhism feel like something a person could actually engage with, rather than merely admire from a respectful and slightly confused distance. His lectures circulated on reel-to-reel tapes through the counterculture like water finding its level, and his central message, that the Western sense of the self as a separate, bounded, isolated ego was a kind of collective hypnosis from which it was possible to wake up, resonated with tremendous force among people who had already, through various means, had some experience of that waking. The Beatles' visit to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's ashram in Rishikesh in 1968 brought transcendental meditation to a global audience overnight. When the four most famous musicians in the world took extended leave to sit quietly in India and breathe, the cultural signal was impossible to ignore. TM centers opened across America. Yoga began its long, slow journey from countercultural practice to Tuesday evening fitness class. Buddhism found Western converts in numbers that would have seemed improbable a decade earlier. Not all of the spiritual seeking was serious or deep. Some of it was fashionable, some of it was superficial, and some of it had the quality of a spiritual buffet where you took what looked appealing without inquiring too carefully about where it came from. But underneath the sometimes shallow surface was a genuine hunger that did not go away when the counterculture ended. It went into meditation apps and hospital mindfulness programs, and the quietly growing conviction that paying attention to the inside of your own mind was not self-indulgence, but a form of basic maintenance. The questions that were asked in that incense-filled room in 1967 are still being asked in different rooms by different people with different apps, but with the same essential restlessness, which suggests they were real questions. The really real ones never do get fully answered. Let's talk about language, because one of the counterculture's most pervasive and least noticed legacies is the way it changed the words Americans use, not just the slang, which came and mostly went like a tide carrying away its own evidence, but the deeper vocabulary of values and critique, the conceptual framework through which Americans argue about what matters and why. You're talking to someone in 1963, and certain words and phrases simply do not yet exist in their current form, or exist only at the outermost edges of the culture where most people have not yet encountered them. Lifestyle, personal space, consciousness raising, the establishment, alternative, getting in touch with your feelings, dropping out. These phrases feel, from the present, so thoroughly ordinary that it is difficult to imagine they had a beginning, that there was a specific moment when they entered the language, when the concepts they named were either unnamed or named differently, and that naming them changed what it was possible to think about. The word lifestyle seems entirely unremarkable now. Everybody has one. Everybody makes choices about theirs. The entire architecture of modern consumer culture is built around helping you express, optimize, and consume yours. But the concept of a lifestyle as something you chose rather than inherited, as an arena of individual self-expression, rather than social obligation, was genuinely radical in the 1960s. The counterculture was the laboratory in which it was developed and tested, the place where tens of thousands of young people deliberately tried to design the texture of their daily existence according to their own principles, rather than the default settings of the culture they were born into. This was a new idea, or at least a newly democratized one, and it changed what subsequent generations thought was available to them, which is to say, it changed almost everything. The establishment entered the language as a term of collective critique around the mid-60s, a way of naming the network of institutions, authorities, professional classes, and cultural norms that maintain the existing order, simultaneously everywhere and resistant to direct confrontation. It gave the counterculture's diffuse sense of opposition a single convenient target. You were not against any one specific policy or person in particular. You were against the establishment, which was broader and more satisfying and considerably harder to argue with, because it was a system rather than an individual. The word stuck because it named something real, the interlocking, mutually reinforcing nature of institutional power, but it also had the disadvantage of being so broad that it sometimes substituted for more precise analysis. If everything is the establishment, nothing is specifically wrong in a way that can be specifically fixed. This tension, between systemic critique and actionable politics has not been resolved. It is still the central argument of every progressive political movement, and it started, in its current American form, roughly here. Consciousness raising meant something specific and important in the counterculture's vocabulary, not just general awareness, but the deliberate collective, often uncomfortable process of examining your own assumptions, seeing the ways you'd been conditioned to accept arrangements that did not serve you, and naming that conditioning clearly enough to begin to act against it. The feminist consciousness-raising groups of the late 60s were the most formally organised version, but the principle ran through the whole counterculture. Waking up to the reality of the war, to the reality of racial inequality, to the reality of your own complicity in systems you'd been taught to take for granted, was framed as a moral and political obligation. You were responsible for what you knew, and you were responsible for knowing. The slang evaporated mostly, as slang always does, carrying the flavour of its moment and then becoming first dated and then camp, and then sometimes retro charming. Cool survived, stripped of its jazz origins and its racial history, and transformed into a universal particle of affirmation so common it now means almost nothing and simultaneously everything. Heavy persisted in music criticism. Vibe has made a remarkable comeback in the 21st century, carrying the counterculture's interest in the felt quality of an environment or relationship into the vocabulary of people who were not born yet when the word was coined. Language, it turns out, is the longest-lasting archive. You carry the 60s in your mouth every time you talk about your lifestyle, every time you call something the establishment, every time you tell someone to get in touch with their feelings, without knowing or needing to know that once, in a specific decade, in a specific argument, those were fighting words. Let's talk about the children, not the baby boomers who made the counterculture, but the actual children, the ones who were born into it or raised inside it, who grew up on communes and in crash pads and in the back of converted school buses rolling across America toward the next gathering, the next commune, the next iteration of the experiment. These were the kids who did not choose the counterculture but inherited it, who had the Summer of Love as their origin story and Altamont as their adolescence and the Reagan 80s as their young adulthood, and who have spent the subsequent decades working out, in various ways, what exactly was given to them and what was taken and what they make of all of it, now that they are old enough to have children of their own who are asking the same questions about their inheritance. You're 7 years old in 1970, and you live on a commune in Northern California, or rural Vermont, or the high desert of New Mexico, and your childhood is, by any conventional measure, extremely unusual. Your home is a converted barn, or a hand-built structure of logs and adobe and considerable optimism, warm near the wood stove and drafty everywhere else, surrounded by land that the adults are attempting to farm with varying degrees of competence. Your breakfast this morning is brown rice with tahini, which is nutritious and which you have developed strong feelings about. The adults around you are your parents, and also, in the commune's theory, everyone's parents. The collective child-rearing principle means that you have more adults paying attention to you than a conventionally raised child might, and also that the consistency of that attention depends significantly on what meeting is happening and who is in the middle of a personal transformation. Someone is always in the middle of a personal transformation. You have learned to make yourself useful during these periods, which is a skill that will serve you for the rest of your life. Your education is informal, which is a word that covers an enormous range of actual experiences. At the organised end were communities that took pedagogy seriously. The farm in Tennessee had real schools with thoughtful teachers, structured curricula, children who grew up literate and numerate and deeply connected to their community. At the less organised end were situations where schooling happened when someone remembered it was supposed to happen, and consisted largely of learning to read and then being left to read whatever was on the shelf, which on some communes meant Tolkien and Carlos Castaneda, and back issues of the Whole Earth catalogue in roughly equal measure. Both produced interesting adults, for different reasons and with different scars. The freedom was real. Running across acres of land without supervision, building forts in the woods, spending long summer days with a mixed-age group of children who were, by necessity, each other's primary social world. This produced people with an unusual comfort with nature, an unusual capacity for independent thinking, and an unusual ability to entertain themselves without screens, which in retrospect looks like a superpower even though at the time it was just Tuesday. The instability was also real. Communes dissolved, adults left. The experiment failed sometimes, or changed, or simply ended, and the children found themselves relocated to cities or conventional schools or grandparents' houses, carrying an origin story that did not translate easily into the language of ordinary childhood. The memoirs these children have written as adults, and there are many of them, a quietly remarkable literature of counterculture childhoods, resist the pull towards simple narratives in ways that are themselves a kind of inheritance from the movement that raised them. They do not tend to conclude that it was all wonderful, or that it was all damage. They tend to conclude that it was both, simultaneously, in ways that cannot be fully separated, that the same conditions that produce genuine gifts also produce genuine costs, and that sorting out which was which has been, for many of them, the work of a lifetime. They are, in the end, the counterculture's most honest accounting, not the legislation, not the music, not the mythology, but the actual human beings shaped by the experiment, carrying all of it forward, the beauty and the difficulty together, into futures that the flower children standing in Haight-Ashbury in 1967 could not have imagined and would, in many ways, recognise. Let's talk about what happened next, because history does not stop at the end of the decade it is named after, and the story of the counterculture is not complete without the story of what became of the people who lived it when the music slowed down and the communes dissolved, and the morning after the 1960s turned out to be, somewhat jarringly, the 1980s. You're in America in 1982, and the country has changed in ways that would have been almost unimaginable to the person you were in 1967, standing barefoot in a San Francisco park holding a flower, and genuinely believing that the world was about to become something better than it had been. That person is still inside you somewhere. They're currently wearing a suit and sitting in a meeting about quarterly projections, and they are trying very hard not to think about the irony. The transition happened gradually and then suddenly, which is how most transitions happen. Through the early and mid-70s, the counterculture did not so much end as disperse, spreading outward from its urban centres into rural communes and university towns, and the everyday lives of people who'd been shaped by the 60s without ever living at its epicentre. The energy of the movement fragmented into its component parts. The environmentalists went to work on the legislation, the feminists built organisations, the spiritual seekers opened meditation centres, the musicians kept touring, the back-to-the-landers kept farming. The movement as a unified cultural force dissolved, but its people went on, carrying what they had learned into the specific corners of American life where they landed. And then Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, and the cultural weather changed with a sharpness that felt, to many veterans of the counterculture, like a door closing. Reagan's America was not interested in questioning the existing order. It was interested in celebrating it, in the Morning in America rhetoric that said the system was not broken and had never been broken, and that the people who said it was broken were the problem. The values that the counterculture had challenged, uncritical patriotism, the equation of consumption with freedom, the supremacy of the market, the suspicion of collective action, were back, louder and more confident than before, with better production values and a much more effective media operation. Many of the boomers who'd been countercultural in the 60s made the turn without apparent difficulty, which was either a pragmatic adaptation to changed circumstances or a revelation of what the counterculture had always been partly about, the self, dressed in the language of the collective. The same generation that had rejected consumer culture in 1967 was driving BMWs in 1984, and the cultural critics had a field day with this, and the cultural critics were not entirely wrong. The yuppie, the young urban professional, upwardly mobile, consumption-oriented, politically disengaged, was in many cases literally the same person who had been a hippie 15 years earlier, and this continuity was uncomfortable to look at directly. But the story is not quite as simple as sellout. The people who had passed through the counterculture did not emerge from it unchanged, even the ones who went on to conventional careers and suburban lives. They voted differently than their parents had. They raised their children differently, with more permissiveness, more conversation, more explicit attention to the children's inner lives and stated preferences, for better and for worse. They brought to their professional lives a residual suspicion of hierarchy, a preference for informal communication over rigid structure, an instinct toward collaboration that shaped the workplaces they built and the organizations they ran. The counterculture's values did not disappear when the boomers put on suits. They went underground, into the texture of how people related to each other, into the assumptions they carried about what work should feel like and what a life well lived required. The ones who did not make the turn, who stayed committed to the original project in its various forms, built the infrastructure of the alternative America that still exists alongside the mainstream one, the organic farming movement that became the organic food industry, the network of alternative health practitioners and community health centres, the environmental organisations that have been fighting, with varying success, for the legislation the first Earth Day helped produce, the feminist organisations, the civil liberties organisations, the community radio stations and alternative newspapers and independent bookstores that maintained, through the Reagan years and beyond, spaces where different values could breathe. These institutions were built by people shaped by the counterculture, and they are still operating, still doing the work, still staffed by people who believe that the questions the 60s raised were real questions and that the answers matter. The morning after the counterculture was not the end of what the counterculture started. It was the long, unglamorous, underfunded, institutionally exhausting work of trying to make the ideals durable, trying to build things that would last past the initial euphoria, past the first wave of backlash, past the comfort of consensus, and into the hard weather of a culture that had decided for a while that it had heard enough from people who wanted to change it. The flowers had been real. The mud had also been real. And the people who had stood in both were still standing, still working, still making the argument, in the long morning after the revolution, that the world they had briefly glimpsed in the summer of 1967 was worth the rest of a lifetime of trying to reach. And so here we are. At the end of a long, strange, sun-drenched, occasionally mud-soaked journey through one of the most turbulent and transformative decades in American history. You have travelled a long way tonight, from the tidy lawns and humming refrigerators of post-war America, through the smoke-filled coffee shops of the Beats, through the painted streets of Haight-Ashbury and the fields of Woodstock, through the commune kitchens and the courtrooms and the ashrams and the long, quiet morning after. You have met people who were imperfect and earnest and sometimes ridiculous and occasionally magnificent, who looked at the world they had been handed and decided, with the particular stubbornness of the young and the particular courage of people who have not yet been told enough times that it cannot be done, that it could be different. They were not always right about how. They were not always right about who got to be part of the vision. They made mistakes that cost real people real things, and the honest accounting of the counterculture requires holding those failures alongside the genuine achievements, without letting either cancel out the other. That is the only way to look at history honestly, not as a story of heroes or villains, but as a record of human beings trying, in the specific conditions of their specific moment, to do something better than what they found. But tonight, as you ease into the quiet and let the day's weight settle, maybe hold this gently. Somewhere in the 1960s, in a field or a living room or a march or a commune kitchen, smelling of brown rice and good intentions, ordinary people decided that the questions mattered, that the earth mattered, that the people being left out of the American promise mattered, that consciousness and community and the examined life mattered. They were barefoot and sunburned and frequently wrong about the dishes, but they were asking real questions, and the questions outlasted the flowers. So tonight, as you sink into your clean, warm bed, with your indoor plumbing and your filtered water, and your air that is measurably cleaner than it might otherwise have been, maybe whisper a quiet thank you into the dark, not for the tie-dye, not for the patchouli, but for the stubborn, hopeful, slightly chaotic insistence that things could be better. Because history may be messy and contradictory and full of people who could not agree on the salt, but it is also proof that ordinary people asking urgent questions loudly enough and long enough can move the world at least a few inches in the direction of something more like what it ought to be. And that tonight is enough to sleep on. Good night.